Recent data shows us that inflammation can affect depression. And guess what? We just went through a pandemic where like some numbers say like 70 to 75% of people had an infection, a COVID-19 infection at one point. We don't know how that inflammation has changed our brains.
I wanted to share this for two reasons. The first is that the topic itself is interesting. I've talked on this channel about how COVID is a very inflammatory disease. It can hyperstimulate our immune system, it can hide away from our immune system and persist in some people. It can get into our brain, and that brain inflammation, as this researcher was talking about, can lead to depression, but it can also impact things like emotional regulation, executive function, our visuospatial ability. The other reason is that the Mel Robbins podcast that this was on is pretty widely listened to, and I wasn't expecting to hear anything about COVID because even though COVID is multi-systemic, affecting most parts of our body, and even though it affected, as the researcher said, 75% of the world population, people are traumatized by that and don't want to talk about it. So you see these articles, for example, about school absenteeism, or people calling out sick to work more often, or why am I sick all the time? You have all these people, noting real problems, but being confused about what it is and not bringing up COVID as a potential. It's not even on the list of possible explanations when it's probably one of the most likely explanations or one of the biggest contributors. And so we should be hearing about COVID more often, even if people think the pandemic is over, which it's not really. But even if the pandemic ended in 2022 or 2023, whatever those people want to say, even if that was the case, the impacts of it will be with us for years and decades. As an article I've covered on the channel before says, pandemics don't end, they echo, and people are not talking about those echoes. So it's really refreshing when they do, and I want you to keep an eye out, in your own mind, and look at the media you're consuming, look at how people are talking about things, and note when people won't even bring up COVID as an option or an explanation for something. Now, because of all the data I look at and how much I think about COVID, maybe I bring it up too often. Maybe I think it's the top 1 or 2 factors in some kind of issue, and maybe it's number 3 or 4 or 5. But when you read articles, it's nowhere to be found, it's not even factored in. And that's how I know I may be wrong, but I am positive that the way most people talk about these things, I'm positive they're wrong because they won't even bring up, a global pandemic that impacted our mind, our hearts, all parts of our body, and most people, and people are getting this thing repeatedly. And so just people not talking about it, I know you're wrong if you don't talk about it, because it just is really impactful. And people are not talking about it because of trauma, and that needs to be attended to and cared for and paid attention to. But this repression and denial and avoidance doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help understand the world around us, and it's just really unhealthy.